Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction Company taking a look at some of the guns that they're going to be selling in their upcoming September of 2017 Premier Auction. What we have here today doesn't really look like a whole lot, but this is actually a very relevant and very important machine gun from World War II. This is a Rheinmetall MG-17, and it was one of the principal armaments on a lot of the German aircraft early in World War II. These were used as the fixed guns on Ju-88s, FW-190s, Bf-109s, Bf-110s, Ju-87s. Most of the German Luftwaffe aircraft that used 8mm Mauser caliber machine guns used these. And if they didn't use this, they used the MG-15, which was basically the same mechanism. So these were manufactured by the Rheinmetall company by way of Solothurn company, sort of. Solothurn wasn't really a company, it was actually an extension of the Rheinmetall company. Now, Rheinmetall had been a manufacturing concern in Germany for, I don't know, a very long time. And they got into they'd been doing artillery and big industrial stuff. And they got into the small arms business right around the turn of the century, 1900, by buying the Dreisig company and its manufacturing facilities. And with all of that, they manufactured a bunch of machine guns during World War I. They made Maxims for the German government, and they had an R&D program that was developing other guns at the end of the war. Now, the Versailles Treaty severely limited the ability of German companies to do small arms research and development, and so, like many others, Rheinmetall started looking to expand outside Germany, to set up constituent companies in other places where they could do R&D. Interestingly, a bunch of these companies actually did a lot of cooperative work with Russia early in the 1930s. And then the big one here that would make a difference was the Rheinmetall company set up a subsidiary in the Swiss town of Solothurn. And this Solothurn company had all of its own gun designations, but they were basically all Rheinmetall designs used under license. And this was basically a way for Rheinmetall to continue doing small arms research and development and production around the limitations of the Versailles Treaty. So the gun that this started out as was a Rheinmetall design, the RH-29, which in Solothurn became known as the S2-200. It was a light machine gun, magazine fed, and it was actually sold to a number of different countries, primarily Austria and Hungary, who adapted it as the M30 and the 31M in 8x56mm. And then Hungary also then adopted an 8mm Mauser version during World War II as the 43M. And this would eventually be adopted by the German military as well under the designation of MG-15. And this gun, it was a box-fed light machine gun, and it was adapted primarily to use as a flexible mount in aircraft. So flexible mount meaning a gun where you actually have a gunner behind the gun aiming it, and it's mounted to like the nose of an aircraft in a glass enclosure, or it's mounted in a window on the side of a large bomber where it can be maneuvered and swung around for a wide field of fire. And in this guise, the gun was adapted to use a 75-round double drum magazine. You've probably seen those. The same magazine was, or the same style of magazine was also used in the MG-34 from time to time. That gun worked quite well. It had a nice high cyclic rate of about 1,000 rounds a minute, which is important for anti-aircraft work because you have very limited opportunities to actually take shots at fast-moving enemy aircraft. So the more bullets you can get out at once, the better. And aircraft-mounted machine guns generally don't have to worry about overheating because they're not used for sustained fire. You don't have an opportunity to just dump endless magazines at a target. And they're generally up in a slipstream, very high altitude where the air is very cold. And air cooling, when you're in a couple 100-mile-an-hour aircraft at high altitude, air cooling totally takes care of any heat issues you might have. So that was the MG-15. And then Rheinmetall, or Solothurn, same company really, adopted or built a slightly modified version, the MG-17, which was belt-fed. The belt-fed version had a slightly higher rate of fire, and it was actually set up not so much to have a guy behind it shooting, but actually to be set up for electronic or pneumatic control. So you could charge the gun by hand, but it was intended really to be charged with a pneumatic system. The belt is there because These were typically mounted in fixed positions. They could be synchronized or they could be not synchronized, i.e. not hooked up to a propeller or not mounted behind a propeller. And in these sorts of mounts, they're generally hidden inside the wings or under the cowling of the aircraft, and there's no way to reload them during flight. So you need a belt feed because you need a large amount of ammunition loaded in the gun ready to go. A 75-round drum magazine won't last long enough to be useful if you can't reload it in flight. So these were set up with there were a couple of limitations or a couple of special adaptations that an aircraft gun needed. One is they typically had to have a very flexible belt. With the high rate of fire and the tight confines of aircraft mounting, they needed a belt that could be wrapped around some pretty tight corners. So these guns used a specialty belt, the GERT 17/81, which coincidentally was used in the MG-17 and the MG-81. That belt was more flexible than, it was basically interchangeable with the standard MG-34 and 42 ground gun belts, but only one direction. So you could use the aircraft belts in the ground guns, but if you tried to reverse it and use a ground belt in an aircraft gun, the gun would work, but because of the flexibility requirements for the mounting positions, the belt itself might not actually physically fit into the whole arrangement. All right, I'm going kind of long here, so why don't we stop rambling so much and take a closer look at a couple of elements of this gun. Now, there's a bunch of stuff bolted to the outside of this gun that's not original, and that is a mounting that some previous owner has added so that they can actually shoot this from a tripod on the ground instead of having to bolt it into a Focke-Wulf 190 or some other German aircraft. So this charging handle is new and added by the owner. There was originally a much smaller manual charging handle, so these could be charged by hand if they needed to be, but there was also a pneumatic system for charging the gun. There was also an electronic or pneumatic control for firing the gun, which is not on the gun at this time. This long bracket has been bolted to the gun, and it's got a mounting point back here and a mounting point up here, and then this is a new trigger system that has been added. Originally, you would have had a mechanical trigger or a remote trigger attached to this, and someone has added this. The reason that they set it up this way is, I'm pretty sure, to interact with the remote trigger on a German MG3 machine gun tripod. So I'm pretty sure that's what this is set up for using on, is that MG3 tripod. Our markings are up here on the top. MG-17, a wildly high serial number. I think actually the first digit of that is just a placeholder, as a serial number block. And then, I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure what this bottom number is. The aircraft machine guns are a subject that I need to study in more depth. However, I can show you how this one works. The most interesting part of it is this block on top. This is the feed block, and these can be set up for either right or left-hand feed, which is important in an aircraft. If you have a pair of them side by side in the nose of a plane, of course, you're going to want them to feed from the outside or from the inside, both. So you could replace this with either left-hand or right-hand feed blocks. To take this off, all I have to do is rotate this pin, spring-loaded pin. This lifts up, and then the whole unit comes off. Now I want to point out this roller. This is on the barrel extension of the gun, so this is going to move back and forth as the gun fires. That roller is going to interact with the feed mechanism and travel in this track. So as that roller comes backward, it forces this to rotate over like so, and then when it goes back, it forces it to go the other direction. There is a ratcheting cam right here, and what this does is, when it goes back, it lines up, and then it pulls this feed drum one position over with each cycling. So if we look in there, you can see, instead of the typical pulls that would pull in the cartridges and then lock behind them, the MG-17 belt feed is based on a rotating ratchet type system. Yeah, there we go, there's a better view for you. So, snaps over, and then feeds in. And you can see how it would be very easy to make this, because the whole assembly is pretty much symmetrical, you could just replace this part and have this thing operate in the opposite direction. You'll notice that the ports on the side are both big enough to feed, and there is this open slot right here. and that's where the belt goes through. The belt that these used was a push-through belt, so there was no need to delink these cartridges separately like there is on, say, an M134 minigun. The belt goes in one side loaded and just comes out the other side empty. And as each cartridge gets in this center position, the bolt's going to come through, push the cartridge through out of the belt, feed it into the gun, fire it, and then this adapter will cycle the next round into place. Now, as for the gun, it is recoil operated, so there's a muzzle booster up at the front, very much like an MG-34. And then we come back here and we get to the action itself. The way this works is based on a design by Louis Stange, who is a pretty impressive designer that a lot of people haven't heard of. He was also, by the way, the guy who designed the FG-42. Now, what we have going on here is we have a bolt in the middle right here, and then we have a barrel extension here, and there is a rotating collar right back inside this section. So the bolt just travels forward and back. It doesn't rotate. However, it has a set of interrupted threads on it back here. And when it's in battery like this, the collar back here has rotated and locks the bolt into the barrel extension, meaning that they can't travel independently. When you fire, this whole thing is going to cycle backwards about 3/4 of an inch, about 18 millimeters, like that. At the end of that travel, this rotating collar back in here rotates the opposite direction, unlocks the bolt, and allows the bolt to travel backwards separately from the barrel extension. So that's the firing cycle right there. It's got a pretty hefty recoil spring, which is what allows it to have that, partly what allows it to have that really high 1,200 round rate of fire. Now this does fire from an open bolt, and it could be synchronized. So the way that works is the firing pin is not fixed. The firing pin actually drops when the bolt is fully in battery. And if this were set up in a synchronized mount, there was an additional piece that could be mounted, and I believe it would mount here, which would interrupt the firing pin and prevent it from dropping if the propeller were in the way of the muzzle. So that's a mechanical setup that could be used. If you were mounting these in the cowl of a single-engine fighter, for example, you would need them to be synchronized like that. Now, if you look closely back here, you can actually see the interrupted threads of the locking collar when I open this. So, right there. There they are. And the actual rotating and locking takes place inside here. I am not going to further disassemble this because I just don't have enough experience with these aircraft guns mechanically to want to mess with that. So I will leave that to the next owner. While the MG-17 was a very important gun in the late 1930s for a lot of German aircraft armament, by the end of World War II, this kind of thing would be pretty much considered obsolete. There was a lot of development of aircraft armament during the war, and the Germans pretty quickly went from 8mm guns like this to 13mm, and then 15mm, and then 20mm, and ultimately all the way up to low-velocity 30mm automatic cannons. They had a low muzzle velocity, but they had a very large payload capacity, so you could pack a lot of explosive into a 30mm shell. And the tactic by the end of the war was, trying to get one good hit on an aircraft that would be destructive enough to destroy the aircraft or knock it down, as opposed to the tactic early in the war where you need to get a lot of little tiny machine gun hits on an aircraft in order to damage it enough to destroy it. So by the end of the war, not so much of a relevant gun anymore. In fact, it would be spare stockpiles of barrels for these, among others, that would be looked at for use in Volkssturm rifles at the end of the war, adapting these spare machine gun barrels to be used in last-ditch rifles. And kind of a cool added element with these. As I mentioned, this thing has been set up with this kind of slick, hand-built, clearly, mounting system to allow it to be, I believe, mounted on a German MG-3 tripod, which are fairly readily accessible and available, cocked by hand, fired with the tripod mount, so that instead of actually needing an airplane to put the thing in, you could take this out and shoot it and enjoy it on a standard ground gun tripod. So that's pretty cool. If you'd like it to be yours and want to go out and try that, well, take a look at the description text below. You'll find a link there to Rock Island's catalog page for this gun. It is a fully registered transferable machine gun under the US NFA. And that link below will take you to their Rock Island's pictures, description, estimated pricing, and all that good stuff. So you can place a bid on it if you'd like it, on the website or over the phone or live at the auction here in person. Thanks for watching.